He turned a shed of barley nobody wanted into a business the big breweries can't stop losing sleep over. And the strangest part? He did it during a global lockdown, when every expert in the industry said it was the worst possible moment to launch anything. This isn't a story about a celebrity slapping his name on a product. This is a story about what happens when someone refuses to accept that's just how it's done and ends up rewriting an entire industry by accident. Autumn 2020, a tractor shed on a farm in the Cotswolds, cold enough that you can see your breath. Jeremy Clarkson is standing over 1,000 acres worth of barley, his first proper harvest, and he's just been told something that would make most people quietly give up. Nobody wants it. The big maltsters weren't interested in small, inconsistent batches from a TV presenter's side project. The grain merchants offered him a price that wouldn't cover the diesel it took to harvest it. His farm manager laid it out plainly. At these numbers, they'd lose money on every single ton they sold. Here's where most people would have written it off. Tax loss. Lesson learned. Back to the day job. Clarkson didn't. Because he wasn't looking at a pile of unwanted grain. He was looking at 50 years of drinking a kind of beer that was quietly vanishing from British pubs, the proper stuff, the kind his father drank, replaced by identical fizzy lager owned by 4 multinational companies pretending to be dozens of different brands. And standing in that shed, he had a thought that most farmers in his position would never have connected. What if the problem and the solution were the same thing? That thought became Hawkstone. He didn't name it after himself. He named it after a half-forgotten Georgian estate in Shropshire, once one of the most talked-about landscapes in England, famous for its dramatic follies and grottos, then left to rot for a century, swallowed by overgrowth and neglect. If that sounds like a strange choice for a beer brand, look closer. It's not branding, it's a thesis statement. Hawkstone Park was magnificent, then forgotten, then eventually worth restoring. That's the exact arc Clarkson was betting British brewing itself could follow. October 2020. Pubs shut. The entire hospitality industry on its knees. Every consultant in the country would have told him, do not launch a premium beer right now. He launched anyway. And here's the detail almost nobody talks about, the thing that actually made it work. It had nothing to do with luck. People were stuck at home with nowhere to spend the money they'd normally burn through on holidays, pub nights, weekends away. They weren't looking for the cheapest beer on the shelf. They were looking for something that made staying in feel like less of a compromise, a small luxury, something that felt like it meant something. Hawkstone sold out faster than the brewery could produce it. But speed isn't the interesting part. The interesting part is why it kept selling once the pandemic novelty wore off, because that's usually where celebrity products quietly die. Here's the detail the big lager brands genuinely cannot copy. No matter how much money they throw at the problem, the barley in every bottle is grown within a few miles of the brewery, not shipped in from wherever the spot price is lowest that quarter. Grown by farmers in Oxfordshire and Gloucestershire who've worked that same land for generations. That sounds like a nice story for the label. It's actually an act of financial self-sabotage that happens to be genius. Local barley costs more. It's less consistent. It's harder to scale. Every single incentive in modern brewing pushes toward the opposite decision. Buy the cheapest grain, wherever it's from, blend it until it's flavorless and uniform, and let the marketing department invent a heritage story to paper over the fact that the beer itself has no home at all. Clarkson did the one thing none of them are structurally able to do. He took the margin hit on purpose. And because it's him, he didn't hide that decision. He showed it. The real costings, the failed batches, the suppliers who let him down. In an industry built on vague sustainability slogans that mean nothing, actual transparency turned out to be the rarest ingredient of all. British drinkers were told a very specific story: we don't make good lager. That's a European thing, German, Czech, Danish. We do warm ale and that's our lot. Nobody questioned who benefited from that story. The same handful of breweries that profited from selling foreign-branded lager, brewed under license, at premium prices, while convincing the public that a genuinely great British lager simply wasn't possible. Clarkson looked at that story and did the thing he's built an entire career on doing. He ignored it completely. 2 years later, Hawkstone was on shelves in Tesco, Sainsbury's, Waitrose, Morrison's, outselling craft brands that had a decade's head start. Not because of the name on the can. Because it tasted like lager is actually supposed to taste, and it happened to be true that it was made by British hands from British grain. Nobody expected the vanity project to still be standing 2 years later. Nobody expected what came next either, because the barley and the lager were only the beginning. What Clarkson built on top of that foundation is where this stops being a beer story and starts being one of the strangest business case studies in modern British agriculture. When Clarkson opened a small farm shop in 2020, the plan was modest. A handful of local visitors, maybe a few curious tourists passing through on a weekend. Nothing that needed serious planning, nothing that needed extra staff or a traffic plan. Tens of thousands of people showed up. They queued for over an hour in the cold to get into a converted shed and buy vegetables at a markup that would make a Waitrose buyer blush. The local council tried to shut the whole thing down over parking and access. Neighbors complained about single-lane roads never built to handle that kind of traffic. For a while, it looked less like a farm shop and more like a small-scale public order problem. And underneath all that friction, something genuinely strange was happening. People weren't just buying carrots. They were driving hours in some cases to stand in a muddy field and actually see where their food came from, a connection an entire generation had quietly lost without really noticing. Hawkstone was sitting right in the middle of that moment, and it didn't cost the brewery a single advertising pound to benefit from it. Every visitor to that farm walked past Hawkstone stacked on the shelves. Every episode of the television series that followed showed the beer being brewed, poured, argued over, enjoyed at the end of a long day. A half-hour advertisement that people were choosing to watch on purpose, week after week, without ever feeling sold to. And because the beer genuinely did come from that farm, none of it registered as product placement. It registered as proof. That's the mechanism most people trying to copy this miss entirely. It wasn't marketing bolted on top of a product afterward. The product and the story were the same object, built at the same time by the same people. Now here's the pricing decision that on paper should have killed the whole thing outright. A 4-pack cost roughly what you'd pay for an imported premium lager, sometimes more. Every conventional rule of the UK beer market says that's commercial suicide. British drinkers, the textbook insists, buy on price above almost everything else. Always have, always will. Clarkson wasn't playing that game, and he wasn't trying to. He wasn't aiming to beat the cheap stuff on the bottom shelf. He was aiming squarely at Peroni, at Estrella, at Birra Moretti, the imported lagers people reach for specifically when they want to feel like they're drinking something a step above the usual. And Hawkstone had one thing none of those brands could ever genuinely claim. The face on the can had actually grown the barley that ended up in the bottle. The price tag wasn't only about margin then. It was a signal, deliberately sent. Cheap beer means corners cut somewhere in the ingredients, in the wages, in the water used to stretch a batch further than it should go. A higher price said, plainly, nothing here was cut. And enough people believed him to make that math work, largely because he'd already shown them the receipts, good and bad. By 2022, Hawkstone faced a decision that quietly kills most young breweries: what to do for an encore. Most new labels take years to get a second product to market, and celebrity-fronted brands almost never manage a real range at all, usually because the first product was the entire idea, and there's nothing underneath it. Clarkson launched 3 at once. A pale ale, an IPA, a cider. Industry watchers assumed at least one would flop quietly within the year. All 3 sold strongly from the very first week. The cider is worth pausing on because it exposed something the wider industry would rather nobody thought about too closely. Most mass-market cider contains a fraction of the actual apple content most drinkers would assume, bulked out with sugar and water, engineered to taste identical batch after batch. Hawkstone cider, by contrast, was made from proper cider apple varieties grown in the Vale of Evesham and the Cotswolds, the bitter, sharp kind nobody eats out of hand, because they're grown purely for pressing. Within months, it was going head-to-head with Strongbow and Magners on supermarket shelves. And, more often than the big cider brands would like, winning. None of this happened by accident, and none of it happened cheaply. Every one of these products could have been brewed and pressed anywhere in Britain through a contract facility for a fraction of the setup cost. That's how the majority of celebrity drinks brands actually operate. A famous name on the label, a faceless factory somewhere else doing the real work, with no connection between the two. Clarkson built his own brewery instead, and staffed it with people from the villages surrounding it, many of whom had lost work when nearby farms mechanized or local factories closed for good. Wages above the industry standard on a fairly simple piece of logic. If you want people to genuinely care about the quality of what they're making, you have to pay them enough that caring is affordable. That decision shows up in numbers a balance sheet rarely captures cleanly. The head brewer has been there since day one, could earn more at a larger operation, and stays because of the creative control. Staff turnover is close to 0. In an industry where the person physically bottling the beer has often never tasted a drop of it, that isn't a soft, feel-good detail. That's quality control money genuinely cannot buy off the shelf. By 2023, Hawkstone ran into a problem that had nothing to do with the quality of the beer and everything to do with raw market power. It was doing well in supermarkets. It was almost invisible in pubs. That wasn't an accident either, it was structural, built deliberately over decades. The big breweries had locked up pub taps through long-term exclusivity deals designed to make it nearly impossible for any outsider to get so much as a single line installed, no matter how good the product behind it actually was. Solving that problem, and what it revealed about how far Clarkson was actually willing to go, is where this story stops being about one clever farm shop and starts becoming something the big breweries genuinely couldn't ignore any longer. Clarkson's answer to the pub problem was blunt, almost embarrassingly simple, and it shouldn't have worked. Every independent pub that agreed to stock Hawkstone got better margins than they'd get from the big suppliers. Direct delivery instead of routing through a distributor, and something no rival brewery could realistically offer, personal involvement from the actual owner of the brand. Small breweries had tried versions of this exact pitch before. Nearly all of them failed, because better margins alone rarely move a landlord who's been locked into the same supplier relationships for 20 years. What made this different was that Clarkson's celebrity turned every pub into a marketing partner without anyone having to ask. A chalkboard outside a pub reading, "We stock Hawkstone," wasn't just an inventory note. It was a reason to walk in. People who'd watched the show wanted to try the beer they'd seen being made in a shed on their television, and they'd specifically seek out pubs that had it, sometimes driving past 2 or 3 closer pubs to find one that did. Within a year, over 500 independent pubs across Britain were pouring it. A significant number reported it outselling their existing house lager entirely, which is the kind of number that gets noticed in board meetings at companies that had spent decades assuming their pub monopoly was permanent. The big breweries had built that wall specifically to keep challengers like this one out. Clarkson didn't climb over it. He gave pubs a reason to want to knock a hole in it themselves. That's the pattern worth sitting with for a second, because it repeats everywhere in this story. He never tried to outcompete the incumbents on their own terms. He kept finding the one lever they'd structurally locked themselves out of pulling, because pulling it would have exposed how little they actually cared about the thing he was selling. Sustainability is the next place that pattern shows up, and it's a word that's been so thoroughly drained of meaning by corporate marketing departments that most drinkers now roll their eyes the second they hear it on a label. Every drinks company on the market claims to be sustainable. Almost none of them can tell you exactly what that means in practice, because for most of them, it's a slide in an annual report, not a decision that ever cost anyone actual money. Hawkstone's version is different, mostly because it's boring and specific rather than inspirational and vague. The barley travels a few miles, not a few hundred, which means the transport footprint is genuinely small rather than offset on paper. The brewery runs partly on solar panels installed on its own roof. The spent grain left over from brewing goes straight back to the farm to feed cattle, closing a loop that most industrial breweries pay to have hauled away as waste. None of that is framed as a crusade to save the planet. It's framed as basic efficiency that happens to be good for the environment as a side effect, which, oddly, is exactly why people believe it. Nobody trusts the brand that tells you it's saving the world one can at a time. People trust the one that says plainly, "We did this because it made financial sense, and here's what it cost us when it didn't." That same instinct for grassroots credibility over glossy campaigns shows up again in where Hawkstone chooses to show up in person, not music festivals, not urban pop-ups with influencers and free samples handed out by people in branded polo shirts. Country shows, farming events, rural agricultural festivals that never make it into a national marketing calendar because there's no media coverage to justify the spend. On paper, it looks like a waste of a marketing budget. In practice, it's the single most targeted audience Hawkstone could possibly reach. These are exactly the people who already care about British farming, who understand precisely what Clarkson is trying to build, who don't need convincing that local barley matters. At these events, nobody's just handing out free cans. Someone's walking visitors through the actual brewing process, introducing them to the farmers who grew the grain in their glass, letting them taste the difference side by side against a mass market lager. That's how you build evangelists instead of customers. Someone who tastes that difference at a county show doesn't just buy a 4-pack on the way out. They go home and tell 3 friends about a beer that's actually made properly. Word of mouth from someone you trust is worth more than any amount of paid media. And Clarkson built an entire distribution strategy on the assumption that this was true long before it showed up in the sales figures. Which brings us to the strangest part of the entire Hawkstone story. The marketing budget is effectively zero, and yet the brand is one of the most talked about drinks companies in Britain. Most beverage companies spend millions on campaigns built around hired celebrities, carefully focused group slogans, and agency-produced adverts designed to manufacture exactly the kind of authenticity Clarkson has for free. Every time he mentions the brewery to his own audience, that's advertising reaching millions of people that cost the company nothing. Every episode of his television show that shows the beer being brewed is a half-hour advertisement people are choosing to watch, rewatch, and clip for social media on their own time. Every newspaper story about one of his public disputes with the council, with a supplier, with anyone, tends to mention the brewery somewhere in the piece. He turned his own public profile into a marketing engine without spending a penny on traditional advertising to build it. But here's the part that actually makes it work, and it's the part competitors keep failing to replicate. It isn't performed. He isn't pretending to like a beer he doesn't drink for the sake of a sponsorship deal. He serves it to guests at his own house. He talks about it when there's no camera pointed at him and nothing to promote. When he criticizes the big breweries for cutting corners on ingredients or squeezing farmers on price, people believe him specifically because he's already shown them what the alternative costs in pounds and pence on his own farm. Other celebrities have tried to launch drinks brands riding on exactly this same playbook. The personal face, the origin story, the authenticity angle, and most of them have quietly disappeared within a couple of years. The reason isn't a lack of budget. It's that you cannot manufacture the thing that actually makes this work, which is that the person on the label genuinely has skin in the game and genuinely cannot fake caring about barley yields. By 2023, Hawkstone had grown enough to need serious distribution infrastructure, and it signed a deal with a major drinks wholesaler that gave it access to thousands of retailers across the country in one move. The immediate assumption from industry watchers was predictable. This is the moment the brand sells out, goes corporate, starts cutting the same corners as everyone else to hit bigger volume targets. That's not what happened. The deal was structured specifically to protect the local ingredient sourcing and the traditional brewing methods that had made the beer worth buying in the first place. It was purely a logistics arrangement. The wholesaler wanted in because retailers were already requesting Hawkstone by name, which is a request pattern that almost never happens with a brand this young. Within months of the deal going live, sales tripled. You no longer needed to live near a Waitrose or make a special trip to the Cotswolds to find a bottle. It proved something the skeptics hadn't accounted for. This wasn't a niche product propped up by wealthy Southern shoppers with disposable income. There was genuine, national appetite for it, once it was simply made convenient to buy. And once that domestic base was secure, Clarkson did something that made even people who'd been won over by everything so far raise an eyebrow. He announced plans to sell British lager back to Europe, and beyond it, to markets that had spent decades treating British beer as a punchline, rather than a product worth importing. Selling British lager into Europe should have been a joke. Belgium and Germany have brewing traditions going back centuries, an entire culture built around the idea that lager is something they do properly and everyone else does badly. Exporting a Cotswolds farm beer into that market sounded, on paper, like selling ice to people who've never seen warm weather. Clarkson's reasoning held up better than the skeptics expected. There are millions of British expats scattered across Europe who miss a very specific, very particular taste of home. And there's a growing international appetite for craft brewing that has nothing to do with nationality and everything to do with quality. Hawkstone's story translates almost perfectly across borders. A famous broadcaster, an actual working farm, ingredients grown a few miles from where they're brewed. That's precisely the kind of narrative that sells at a premium abroad, where authentically British carries a certain cachet rather than the slight cultural cringe it sometimes carries at home. The first export markets were exactly where you'd expect: Spain, Portugal, France, wherever British expat communities cluster. But then orders started arriving from places nobody had planned for. Australia, Canada, pockets of Asia where British culture, oddly, still carries weight. The export arm remains small next to domestic sales, but it's growing, and it's profitable because Hawkstone commands premium pricing overseas in a way it never quite could at home. What looked like a liability, being obviously unmistakably British in a market dominated by continental brands, turned into the exact thing that made it sellable. Back home, walk into the farm shop and you'll notice something odd. There's almost as much Hawkstone merchandise on the shelves as there is actual beer. T-shirts, caps, glassware, bottle openers, even branded dog bowls. On the surface, that looks like shameless commercial overreach, the kind of thing that makes a brand feel more interested in your wallet than its own product. In practice, it's one of the smarter decisions in the whole operation. Merchandise carries higher margins than beer ever will. And every person wearing a Hawkstone t-shirt on the street is a walking advertisement who paid for the privilege of being one. But there's a deeper mechanism underneath the profit math. Buying the merchandise isn't really about the object, it's about signaling membership. A statement that you're part of something, people choosing to back British farming over convenience, people who like the idea of a smaller supply chain sticking it to a much bigger one. It's the same psychology that sells football shirts and band t-shirts. Identity first, products second. Somewhere along the way, almost by accident, Hawkstone turned into a lifestyle brand, and lifestyle brands carry margins that beer alone could never match. Every brewery in Britain dreads January and February. The Christmas spending hangover hits, budgets tighten, and beer sales slump across the board almost without exception. In 2024, instead of accepting that slump as the cost of doing business, Hawkstone launched a winter ale built specifically for those two miserable months. Darker, richer, stronger, made to be drunk next to a fire rather than in a beer garden in July. The prevailing wisdom said this was a bad idea. Seasonal products are genuinely risky, and ale drinkers tend to be fiercely loyal to whatever brand they already trust, which makes them one of the hardest audiences in the country to convert. It sold out within weeks anyway. There was, it turned out, real unmet demand for a proper British ale built on the same principles as the lager, local ingredients, traditional brewing, nothing hidden. Sales across January and February came in roughly 40% higher than the year before, almost entirely because of one seasonal product that wasn't supposed to work. It's now a permanent fixture, and it opened Hawkstone up to an entirely new customer base of ale drinkers who'd never have touched the lager in the first place. Then there's the part of the business that has nothing to do with quarterly sales figures at all. Hawkstone runs brewery tours and farm visits specifically for schools, walking teenagers through exactly how beer gets made and where food actually comes from before it reaches a supermarket shelf. It isn't framed around alcohol at all. It's framed around the basic, startling fact that most British teenagers genuinely don't know that barley becomes beer, that hops grow on vines, that brewing is applied chemistry happening in front of them. Teachers have noticed something else too. Students who tune out of a standard science lesson pay attention the moment Jeremy Clarkson is standing in front of them explaining fermentation. There's an obvious long-term commercial logic sitting underneath all of it. Today's school kids are tomorrow's customers, and they'll remember exactly which brewery took the time to explain any of this to them. But it would be selling the whole thing short to call it pure strategy. Clarkson has said, more than once, that if the next generation grows up believing food simply originates at a supermarket with no connection to the land at all, British farming doesn't have much of a future left. The education program serves the business and serves that belief simultaneously, which is a rarer combination than it should be. In 2024, Hawkstone did something that would have been unthinkable for a British lager brand a decade earlier. It partnered with high-end restaurants to build tasting menus designed specifically around the beer, dish by dish. Pairing menus had always belonged to fine wine, to craft ale, to Belgian beer with a pedigree stretching back centuries, never to British lager, which had spent generations being treated as something you drink, not something you pair with food. Michelin-starred kitchens started putting it on drinks lists anyway, building dishes specifically to sit alongside it. That single shift opened Hawkstone up to an entirely different customer, people with real disposable income who'd never have picked it up off a supermarket shelf, but who trusted the restaurant enough to try it there first. A meaningful number became regular buyers afterward, having discovered the beer somewhere that had nothing to do with a farm shop or a television screen. Clarkson managed something most brands never pull off cleanly, elevating a working-class drink into a dinner party staple without alienating a single person who'd supported it from the very beginning. Very few brands ever thread that needle without losing one side of the audience entirely. The ambition from here is, by Clarkson's own admission, borderline absurd. He wants Hawkstone to become one of Britain's major breweries within a decade, not by adopting the industrial playbook of the companies he's spent years quietly needling, but by proving that playbook is already obsolete. There's a larger brewery planned, one capable of tripling output while keeping every commitment to local sourcing intact. There are conversations already underway with farming cooperatives across the country, aimed at building a genuine regional supply network instead of one centralized operation trying to serve the whole of Britain from a single Cotswold site. Said out loud by anyone else, that sounds like fantasy, and local values essentially never coexist in this industry by design. But Clarkson has already been wrong to bet against often enough that dismissing this outright now seems like the riskier position. Hawkstone is currently valued at somewhere around £75 million and still climbing. Ask Clarkson about that number directly. And he tends to steer the conversation somewhere else entirely, toward the farmers who now have a guaranteed buyer for their barley every single season. The brewery staff with stable, well-paid jobs in villages that had been losing them for years. The pubs that found something worth putting on a chalkboard outside. The money is real. It just isn't the point. What he's actually proven is more interesting than the valuation. Celebrity-backed brands don't have to be hollow. British consumers will pay more for a product when someone's honest with them about exactly why it costs more. A brewery can genuinely support the farmers it depends on rather than quietly hollowing them out for a good marketing line. He took a shed full of barley nobody wanted and turned it into a case study nobody in the industry can afford to ignore anymore. If British farming has a future worth paying attention to, this is what it looks like. And it started with a problem that should have ended the whole idea before it even began. He named it after a half-forgotten Georgian estate in Shropshire, once one of the most talked-about landscapes in England, famous for its dramatic follies and grottos, then left to rot for a century, swallowed by overgrowth and neglect. If that sounds like a strange choice for a beer brand, look closer. It's not branding, it's a thesis statement. Hawkstone Park was magnificent, then forgotten, then eventually worth restoring. That's the exact arc Clarkson was betting British brewing itself could follow. October 2020. Pubs shut. The entire hospitality industry on its knees. Every consultant in the country would have told him, do not launch a premium beer right now. He launched anyway. And here's the detail almost nobody talks about, the thing that actually made it work. It had nothing to do with luck. People were stuck at home with nowhere to spend the money they'd normally burn through on holidays, pub nights, weekends away. They weren't looking for the cheapest beer on the shelf. They were looking for something that made staying in feel like less of a compromise, a small luxury, something that felt like it meant something. Hawkstone sold out faster than the brewery could produce it. But speed isn't the interesting part. The interesting part is why it kept selling once the pandemic novelty wore off, because that's usually where celebrity products quietly die. Here's the detail the big lager brands genuinely cannot copy. No matter how much money they throw at the problem, the barley in every bottle is grown within a few miles of the brewery, not shipped in from wherever the spot price is lowest that quarter. Grown by farmers in Oxfordshire and Gloucestershire who've worked that same land for generations. That sounds like a nice story for the label. It's actually an act of financial self-sabotage that happens to be genius. Local barley costs more.